September 7th, 1940. The night air over southern England was thick with smoke, fire, and the acrid scent of burning timber. London's streets were darkened by blackout curtains, yet through the faint glow of distant flames, you could see the silhouettes of rooftops trembling under the roar of Luftwaffe bombers. Anti-aircraft guns thudded in rhythm with the chaos above, sending tracer shells arcing into the ink-black sky. Somewhere in a small laboratory in Bodsey Manor, Suffolk, a young scientist named Robert Watson Watt leaned over a cluttered workbench, sweat beading on his brow, listening to the distant rumble of planes and explosions. The pressure was unbearable. Every second counted. Every measurement, every calculation could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of civilians below. Watson Watt's team of engineers, technicians, and assistants were huddled around the primitive oscilloscopes and coils of ordinary steel, trying to coax from them something extraordinary, a machine that could see the enemy before they struck. Outside, the wail of air raid sirens mixed with the rhythmic pounding of bomber engines. Inside, wires sparked, circuits hummed, and minds raced. Watson Watt's fingers trembled as he adjusted the angles of a crude antenna array, its steel frame almost laughably simple against the complexity of the problem it was meant to solve. Yet tonight, he wasn't just building a machine, he was forging hope. If we can detect them even a few miles out, he whispered to his assistant, Flight Lieutenant Arnold Wilkins, we might just have a chance to fight back, to give Britain a fighting chance. Wilkins nodded, his face illuminated by the green glow of the cathode tubes, knowing the stakes. The Luftwaffe would not wait, and Britain had no time to lose. Outside, flares painted the night sky red as bombers descended, unaware they were about to encounter a force they could neither see nor anticipate. The ordinary steel and electronics on that table, pieces of what seemed like nothing, held the potential to change the entire course of the battle. Watson Watt adjusted one more dial, the room tense with anticipation, and suddenly the faint static on the oscilloscope jumped. A blip appeared, small, flickering, almost imperceptible. It's there, he murmured, voice barely audible over the distant explosions. We can see them coming. In that moment, a new kind of warfare was born, not with bombs, nor bullets, but with invisible waves cutting through the darkness, turning ordinary steel into Britain's eyes in the sky. The following morning, September 8th, 1940, a damp fog clung to the rolling fields of Bodsey Manor. The manor, once a quiet coastal estate, had been transformed into a hive of urgency and invention. Engineers scurried across the compound, hauling coils of steel, tangled wires, and bulky cathode ray tubes. Every step echoed against the concrete floors of hastily converted labs. Watson Watt moved among them like a conductor, hands gesturing, directing the flow of work with meticulous precision. Flight Lieutenant Wilkins knelt beside a wooden framework holding a crude aerial, adjusting its alignment while muttering calculations under his breath. If we tilt it 3 degrees north, we should extend detection by another 5 miles, he said, eyes fixed on the oscillograph's flickering green line. Around them, ordinary steel rods and metal plates, initially dismissed as just scrap, were being transformed into the backbone of a device no one outside this lab could yet comprehend. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the distant thrum of Luftwaffe bombers preparing to strike. Every engineer understood the stakes. The equipment they were assembling wasn't just experimental. It was Britain's last hope to intercept enemy aircraft before they reached London. Watson Watt's mind raced as he supervised the soldering of vacuum tubes, the precise tensioning of wires, and the calibration of fragile dials. One misstep could ruin days of work and cost countless lives. By midday, the first operational chain of antennas stood erect on the estate's grounds. A lattice of ordinary steel beams and plates now resembled a skeletal forest, each array pointing toward the channel as if straining to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Watson Watt stepped back, wiping soot and sweat from his face, and surveyed the creation. The team held their breath as he powered the system. A low hum filled the air, a heartbeat of technology, and on the oscilloscope, tiny blips began to dance. Aircraft, Wilkins whispered, pointing. About 20 miles out, heading straight for Dover. A collective exhale swept through the room. For the first time, They could detect the enemy long before the anti-aircraft guns opened fire, long before the Luftwaffe's shadows touched London's rooftops. This crude steel framework, these assembled wires and tubes, had become a sentinel in the night, a guardian that transformed ordinary metal into something miraculous. By evening, the first data was being logged, interpreted, and relayed to Fighter Command. Reports flowed through the network of operators like a new nervous system for Britain's air defenses. Every blip, every flicker of the oscilloscope, represented an enemy aircraft that could now be intercepted. Watson Watt moved from console to console, correcting angles, adjusting sensitivities, and teaching his team to read the oscillograph like a map of the sky. It wasn't perfect. The system could misread flocks of birds as bombers or be disrupted by atmospheric interference. But even these early successes were revolutionary. Ordinary steel and electrical components, once mundane, ignored, and taken for granted, had become the eyes and ears of a nation under siege. And as night fell again over southern England, the hum of the radar arrays mingled with distant explosions over London. Somewhere above the Channel, enemy bombers were being tracked, their approach now known, their every move recorded. For the men in the lab, the impossible had begun to take shape. By late September 1940, Bodsey Manor's radar prototype had proved its worth, but the challenge had only just begun. The British Air Ministry demanded operational systems along the entire southeastern coast, from Kent to Suffolk, ready to detect incoming Luftwaffe raids at any hour. Watson Watt and his team faced the impossible: scale a delicate, experimental device into a full-fledged national defense network practically overnight. Steel beams and antenna arrays were shipped by rail and lorry to remote cliff tops and farmland, often under the cover of darkness to avoid German reconnaissance. Engineers climbed precarious ladders to erect towers, sometimes in driving rain or freezing wind, balancing fragile cathode tubes atop trembling frameworks. Watson Watt visited each new installation, his trench coat flapping in the wind, eyes scanning each antenna for alignment and stability. He barked instructions over the clamor of bolts, wind, and distant artillery. 3 more degrees north. Tighten the guy wires. Check the vacuum tubes. Every adjustment mattered. A misalignment could mean missing an entire raid. By October, the first operational chain-home radar stations were ready. Operators in bunkers crouched over oscilloscopes, tracing the sky's invisible contours. 2 contacts, bearing 145 degrees, altitude 12,000 feet, called out 1 technician. Fighter Command, receiving the feed via telephone lines and teleprinter, scrambled Spitfires from nearby airfields. In real time, pilots could intercept enemy formations long before they saw London's lights, a reversal of the usual terror of surprise raids. Ordinary steel, once just structural support, now carried electronic signals that could decide the fate of thousands of lives. Watson Watt walked among the operators late one night, listening to the rhythmic tapping of telegraph keys and the soft hum of radar oscillators. He felt a surge of both pride and anxiety. Each blip on the screen represented a human story, an enemy plane detected, a life potentially saved, a London neighborhood spared from fire. And yet the enemy was relentless. Bombers came nightly, some evading detection, forcing continuous calibration and ingenuity. Engineers slept in shifts on cots beneath steel scaffolding, rising at all hours to check alignments and tweak dials. They were fighting a war of wits, not just with bombs, but with invisible waves coursing through ordinary steel. In the skies above Dover, pilots of No. 11 Group Fighter Command began to notice the difference. Radar warnings arrived minutes before the bombers were visually detected. Spitfires took off into the pre-dawn gloom, guided by a network that extended beyond human eyes. German crews, unaware of the invisible web tracking them, flew into a trap they could neither see nor anticipate. For the first time, Britain had transformed night and fog from shields for the enemy into weapons against them. By mid-October, the impact was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, expecting London to be an easy target under cover of night, was intercepted repeatedly. Pilots returning from raids spoke in hushed, astonished tones about the precision and coordination of British defenses. Behind the scenes, Watson Watt and his team continued to refine their arrays, extending range, reducing errors, and integrating communication lines with radar operators and fighter squadrons. What had begun as a fragile experiment in a foggy laboratory had become the backbone of Britain's aerial defense, a testament to ingenuity under pressure and the extraordinary potential hidden within ordinary steel. By late October 1940, the Battle of Britain was reaching its most critical phase. The Luftwaffe, confident from weeks of relentless bombing, believed that the Royal Air Force could be broken by sheer force of numbers. What they did not know was that an invisible network of steel and wires stretched across the southeastern coast, watching their every move. In command bunkers, radar operators became the unsung heroes of the fight, their eyes glued to flickering screens while pilots relied on their reports to intercept incoming waves of enemy aircraft. Watson Watt, walking through a dimly lit control room at a chain home station near Dover, observed the nervous concentration of the young operators. Sweat glistened on foreheads, fingers poised over dials and switches, yet a quiet confidence permeated the room. 3 bogeys at 30 miles, one called out. The RAF scrambled fighters before the bombers could even be visually spotted. Through the ordinary steel antennas, Britain now possessed a window into the Luftwaffe's plans, transforming fear into strategy. On the cliffs above the English Channel, engineers adjusted massive aerial arrays as another raid approached. Gusting wind whipped around the towers, bending steel rods and rattling wires, yet the arrays held firm. "Keep the sweep clear," Watson Watt instructed, his voice steady despite the roar of approaching engines. Each radar pulse sent out across the water was a lifeline, a signal that could alert pilots and civilians alike. Ordinary steel, electrified and tuned with precision, had become the guardian of an entire nation. Meanwhile, in the skies, German bomber formations began to falter. Fighters guided by radar broke through formations, shooting down aircraft that had once flown with impunity. Reports filtered back to Luftwaffe command, puzzling and demoralizing their pilots. "Where are they coming from?" they asked, baffled by interceptions occurring far before any visual contact. The British advantage, rooted in wires, circuits, and steel frames, remained invisible yet devastatingly effective. Back at Bodsey Manor, Watson Watt reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The initial blips they had detected weeks earlier had multiplied into a web covering the southern coast, providing early warning across a vast expanse. His mind raced with improvements: longer-range detection, more sensitive receivers, faster communication to fighter command. Every advancement was a race against time, a gamble with lives hanging in the balance. Yet the impossible had already been achieved. The ordinary materials at their disposal had become a technological miracle, shifting the momentum of the battle. By November, the cumulative effect of radar-guided interceptions was clear. RAF fighter squadrons, armed with knowledge of enemy positions, inflicted unsustainable losses on the Luftwaffe. The once feared night raids were mitigated, and civilian casualties, though tragic, were far lower than they might have been. Britain had transformed ordinary steel, wires, and vacuum tubes into a weapon as critical as any Spitfire or Hurricane. And at the heart of it all stood Watson Watt and his engineers, who, under immense pressure, had turned the invisible into the decisive. December 5, 1940. A biting wind swept across the cliffs near Dover, rattling the radar arrays like skeletal sentinels in the dark. Inside the bunkers, operators hunched over oscilloscopes, their breath fogging the glass as they tracked blips crawling across the screens. The Luftwaffe was relentless, probing defenses with sporadic night raids, yet every aircraft that approached was now detected, tracked, and reported in real time. Ordinary steel had become Britain's most vital sentry, transmitting pulses of hope through the fog of war. Watson Watt moved from station to station, nodding at familiar faces and checking calibrations. He noticed young women in uniform, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, scanning dials and logging data with remarkable focus. Their steady hands and sharp eyes were now a crucial part of the invisible shield protecting London and southern England. "Accuracy up by 5%, one operator called out. A small but significant victory in a war where even incremental gains could save thousands of lives. On the cliffs, the radar towers shivered under gusts, yet they stood firm, steel and wires humming with electrical energy. Each pulse sent out across the channel was a whisper of warning, a message to RAF pilots in the airfields waiting for guidance. Fighter squadrons leapt into action with unprecedented precision. Spitfires and Hurricanes soared into the night, guided by the steady hand of radar operators, intercepting enemy bombers before they reached populated areas. Meanwhile, Watt reviewed technical logs, noting how ordinary steel, once regarded as mundane construction material, had become a conductor for sophisticated electronic signals. These seemingly simple metal rods and plates, combined with vacuum tubes and oscillators, had created a defensive web that extended miles into the sky. The ingenuity required to convert such basic materials into cutting-edge radar technology under wartime pressure was staggering, and yet here it was, saving lives nightly. The results were undeniable. By mid-December, the Luftwaffe had begun adjusting tactics, realizing that surprise attacks were no longer guaranteed. British pilots, guided by the radar network, had inflicted unsustainable losses, turning the tide of the Battle of Britain. Ordinary steel, once unremarkable, had been transformed into a silent guardian, its true power invisible to both enemy and civilian eyes. In laboratories, bunkers, and cliffside stations, the combination of human ingenuity and resourcefulness had forged an unbreakable link between technology and survival. For Watt and his team, there was no fanfare, no medals at the time. Only the quiet satisfaction of seeing the blips on a screen translating into real-world impact. As the wind howled outside and the radar pulses swept across the channel, it was clear Britain now possessed a weapon the Luftwaffe could neither see nor comprehend. Ordinary steel had become extraordinary, and in the darkness of those nights, it had saved a nation. By early 1941, the radar network Watt had nurtured was no longer experimental. It was the backbone of Britain's air defense. Chain home stations stretched along the southeastern coast like a series of vigilant sentinels, steel towers rising from cliff tops and marshes, each array pulsing with electromagnetic waves slicing through the misty air. RAF Fighter Command relied on these signals as much as they relied on their aircraft. Pilots came to trust the invisible hand guiding them toward incoming raids, saving countless lives and preserving vital infrastructure. Watt rarely received public recognition. Instead, he continued to move from station to station, observing, adjusting, and refining the technology. Each day brought new challenges: atmospheric interference, mechanical failures, and the constant evolution of enemy tactics. Yet the young engineers and operators he trained responded with ingenuity and dedication, turning every problem into a step forward. Ordinary steel, carefully aligned and electrified, became more than just metal. It was a bridge between human foresight and the chaos of war. Even months later, pilots still marveled at the precision of interceptions. How did they know we were coming? They asked in bewilderment after returning from missions. The answer, invisible yet undeniable, lay in the web of radar waves radiating from ordinary steel towers, transformed into a weapon of awareness. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by constant losses, began to suspect unseen eyes were guiding the defenders, yet could never locate the source. Britain had gained an almost supernatural advantage, born not of magic, but of steel, circuits, and relentless human determination. The impact of Watt's innovation extended beyond the Battle of Britain. Scientists and engineers across the Allied nations took notice, adapting the principles of radar for naval operations, airborne detection, and later, even missile guidance. What began as a desperate, overnight solution to detect bombers became a foundation for modern electronic warfare. The ordinary steel that once lined workbenches and labs had been elevated into a symbol of ingenuity, resilience, and the extraordinary power of applied science under extreme pressure. As the months turned to years, Watt's contributions became a silent, persistent guardian over Britain. The pilots, operators, and civilians who survived the Blitz owed their lives, in part, to the pulsing steel towers and the minds behind them. The story of ordinary materials transformed into extraordinary capability reminds us that innovation often arises from necessity, courage, and relentless determination. In the face of overwhelming odds, one scientist and his team proved that even the most mundane objects could be wielded to reshape history. January 15, 1941. Inside a dimly lit chain home bunker near Dover, the air was heavy with smoke, damp, and exhaustion. Operators hunched over oscilloscopes, their eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. Outside, a biting wind rattled the steel towers, bending wires and antenna supports as if testing their resilience. The machines hummed, faithful yet demanding, each pulse a relentless reminder that lives depended on precision. Watson Watt moved among his team, noting the tension etched on young faces. Many were barely 20, their hands shaking as they logged incoming aircraft blips. Mistakes could be fatal. "Check the calibration again," he barked as a technician misread a signal. Outside, anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky, tracer shells crisscrossing the darkness, a chaotic ballet of death. Every successful detection meant fewer bombs hitting cities, yet each failure could be catastrophic. The pressure extended beyond fatigue. Supplies were limited, and spare parts arrived slowly. Steel rods twisted during storms, vacuum tubes burned out under constant operation, and the team worked tirelessly to replace them. Night after night, engineers slept in shifts on cots beneath the towering antennas, dreaming in circuits and radar waves. Watson Watt, despite his calm demeanor, carried the weight of Britain's fate on his shoulders, knowing that the lives of pilots, civilians, and soldiers rested on the pulses of ordinary steel. Yet in this relentless pressure, a strange camaraderie emerged. Operators and engineers shared whispered jokes, improvised solutions, and moments of quiet triumph when a blip appeared exactly where it should. Every corrected error, every successful interception, was a small victory against the relentless assault of the Luftwaffe. The human cost was immense, but it forged a bond that would carry them through the darkest nights of the Blitz. By February 1941, the chain-home radar network had proven its worth, but Watson Watt knew it could be better. The early systems, while effective, were limited in range and struggled to detect low-flying aircraft hiding in valleys or clouds. In response, teams of engineers began experimenting with taller steel towers, more sensitive receivers, and innovative filtering techniques to separate aircraft from weather interference. Ordinary steel rods were transformed into intricate antenna arrays, each adjustment amplifying detection power and reliability. At a station near Rye, Watson Watt observed the installation of a new rotating aerial on a lattice of reinforced steel. "If we can sweep the horizon continuously," he explained to Wilkins, "we can cover areas that were blind spots before. No bomber will pass unnoticed." Technicians adjusted the tension on wires and aligned the coils with millimeter precision, knowing that even a single misalignment could create blind spots. Night after night, they tested, recalibrated, and logged results, the hum of electricity mixing with the distant drone of enemy reconnaissance planes. Meanwhile, in command bunkers, operators learned to interpret subtle differences in the radar blips. They developed new codes and signals, improving communication with fighter squadrons. Ordinary steel had become the backbone of a system that extended not just across the southeastern coast, but into the skies themselves, guiding Spitfires toward enemy formations with remarkable accuracy. With every refinement, the invisible web of detection grew stronger, faster, and more precise. These breakthroughs began to pay off in combat. Pilots reported spotting enemy aircraft only minutes after the radar detected them miles away. The combination of heightened sensitivity, improved communication, and faster response times turned the chain-home network into an almost prophetic tool, allowing the RAF to intercept raids with unprecedented efficiency. Watson Watt's ordinary steel, now electrified and amplified, had become an extraordinary instrument of survival. March 3, 1941. The early morning sky over Kent was a steel-gray canvas, heavy with clouds and anticipation. Radar operators at the Dover chain home station squinted at the oscilloscopes, tracking faint blips moving steadily across the screen. 6 bogies, heading straight for Canterbury, one operator reported, her voice steady but tense. Within minutes, the warning had reached RAF Fighter Command, and Spitfires roared off the airfield, engines slicing through the cold dawn air. Watson Watt stood behind the operators, binoculars in hand, watching as the first interceptors climbed into position. The Luftwaffe formation, unaware that they were already being tracked, maintained a steady course toward their target. Then, As if guided by an unseen hand, the Spitfires appeared from above, diving into the enemy formation with precision. Machine guns rattled, tracer fire lit up the sky, and one by one, enemy bombers began to fall. Ordinary steel and vacuum tubes, once humble and unassuming, had orchestrated this victory before a single shot had been fired from British soil. Down below, civilians remained largely unaware of the radar network at work. The bombs that did fall were fewer than expected, and damage was minimized. News of the interception traveled quickly among pilots and military staff. Britain now had the means to anticipate attacks, to turn the tide in battles that had once seemed hopeless. Watson Watt allowed himself a rare smile, realizing that months of sleepless nights, calculations, and painstaking assembly had culminated in this first major success. The Luftwaffe's confidence was shaken. Intercepted, frustrated, and outmaneuvered by a force they could not see, German commanders began to underestimate the skies they once dominated. Meanwhile, Watson Watt's team returned to the labs and stations, tweaking, recalibrating, and learning from every engagement. Ordinary steel, transformed into a conduit for radar waves, had not only saved lives, it had begun to shape the course of the war itself. Spring 1941. The skies over southern England had grown quieter, but the work inside Bawdsey Manor and the chain home stations never stopped. Robert Watson Watt, now recognized within military circles as the father of radar, walked through the labs where engineers and operators fine-tuned arrays, replaced worn vacuum tubes, and mapped new detection zones. Despite the growing success, he remained modest, deflecting praise to the countless assistants, pilots, and technicians who had made the invisible shield possible. Flight Lieutenant Arnold Wilkins, Watson Watt's trusted collaborator, demonstrated a new variation of the antenna array to a group of young engineers. Each wire, coil, and steel rod was meticulously aligned, a testament to months of trial, error, and ingenuity. Watson Watt watched silently, noting the care and dedication of his team. Every night of exhaustion, every makeshift repair during storms, every anxious glance at flickering oscilloscope screens had forged not just a system of detection, but a family bound by purpose and perseverance. News began to filter through London and military command. Radar had become the linchpin of Britain's air defense. Pilots credited the network with countless successful interceptions, and intelligence officers realized that early warning gave Britain the strategic advantage it so desperately needed. Yet for Watson Watt and his team, the greatest reward was quieter, the knowledge that the ordinary steel rods, coils, and electronics they had wrested into service were saving lives nightly. By mid-1941, the chain home system had expanded, refined, and integrated fully with fighter command operations. Britain's defense had transformed from reactive to proactive, and the tide of the Battle of Britain had irrevocably shifted. Watson Watt and his team had achieved the seemingly impossible. They had turned ordinary steel into a weapon of foresight, courage, and survival. In the shadow of war, innovation, dedication, and human ingenuity had combined to create a technology that would change history and ensure that, when the bombs fell, Britain would see them coming.